Hello, What Is Owed listeners? I'm Soraya Wintersmith, and today we're doing something a bit different with the pod. Normally you'd hear a little mini story and then theme music and then some questions to guide our episode's exploration. But this time, I'm handing the episode reins over to a very special guest host. You've seen him in Rolling Stone and MSNBC. He is now the editor-in-chief at the nonprofit digital magazine, The Emancipator. He's Jamil Smith. And he's here now to say a little bit about what we're going to hear in this episode. Hi, Jamil.
Hello.
So GBH and The Emancipator have been flirting about this journalistic mashup, and now it's actually happening as we wrap up the What Is Owed series. It's really good to have you here.
Thank you very much for having us.
Jamil, when I think about you leading an outlet with a mission and a legacy like The Emancipators, first newspaper devoted solely to the abolition of slavery, now a digital publication that aims to turn America against racist ideas, it makes me think of you kind of like a social justice Dr. Manhattan, the DC Comics character. You're laughing, but I'm serious. He can perceive the past and the present and the future all at once. And you are always in the realm of social justice, and you're kind of always keeping an eye towards history or where our society has been.
Yes.
And you're thinking about how that history brings us to where we are now, and you're thinking about what those things might mean for us moving forward. And I think, unlike Dr. Manhattan, you do want to invite other humans into what you've been thinking about. And I think that's part of the inspiration for the conversation you organized for today. Is that right?
Yes. I believe on one of Dr. Manhattan's only weaknesses is that he lacked empathy. And I certainly appreciate the comparison. And I certainly hope that our movement can be as powerful as Dr. Manhattan was at some point. But I do think that at some point, we are journalists. We have to understand that we are here to report and to analyze and offer commentary, but ultimately that is our mission. And what we want to do with this episode and all of our work beyond it is to illuminate why these narratives, why these stories need to be told, and why people need to understand that they are part of the process to get to the goals that we're trying to achieve.
So, tell us who we're going to be hearing from today, and why'd you choose them?
Essentially, what we want to do is with this episode is help people understand that there is a future for reparations. We want to look towards what can be, what should be, what needs to be. And that's why what we have here is a wonderful panel of Callie Crossley from GBH News, a host and commentator, Cornell William Brooks, the esteemed Harvard Kennedy professor and former president and CEO of the NAACP, and Dara, a co-director of Cambridge Heart, a non-carceral community crisis and care program. And I feel like between the local voices and, of course, Dr. Brooks, who has been, an immensely important voice for, I would say, social accountability rather than social justice. I feel that, that these folks here, having them here, it's going to provide us the garden for hopefully a blooming conversation.
Okay, so here it is, a conversation on the future of reparations.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. The first question I have for you all is broad. And it's, what does a repaired society look like? I mean, the Boston we're imagining after enacting reparations is going to look radically different if we get there. And I want to know, how do you feel people will embrace that change? And I want to start with you, Professor Brooks.
I'd like to think of a repaired Boston, a repaired country, as Boston better than its best, and America better than its best, meaning no racialized hidden pockets of poverty in clear sight. A Boston in which all of our institutions are thriving, all of our neighborhoods are thriving. Black people prosper and are prominent and are healthy and represent the best of this city in a way that acknowledges our full humanity, point one. Point two, it is a city in which, and a country in which, a society in which we don't merely acknowledge the past, begrudgingly, but we recognize it, we embrace it, we honor it, and we attempt to reconcile ourselves with it by remediating the ongoing harms.
There are a few cities that embody the history of this country more so than Boston. And Callie, I wanted to ask, what does it mean symbolically, given Boston's history, to be a national leader in reparations?
Well, it means everything, actually, because Boston's reputation, stubbornly, as we know, is one of the most racist cities in the country. You could argue whether that's true or not, but that is the reputation as it stands now. So for Boston to do what essentially would be a 360-degree flip would be amazing.
Indeed.
Now, is that impossible to think about if we're thinking radically and out of the box? No, because Boston has been a leader in so many other arenas in terms of innovation. And if we did, as Professor Brooks has said, embrace the past and recognize it, then folks would know that the first person to die in the revolution was a black man, Crispus Attucks, and that there were black people in Lexington on that field, and that so many others that we could name. And so that we already have shed blood and been embedded in the fabric of the city to begin with. So why are we arguing about that? So we'd be in a place where everybody would recognize that we have blood ties to this city.
Amen. Dara, we're not just talking about Boston here, of course. We're talking about Cambridge, all the surrounding communities. I'm interested to know, what examples of success presently can we look at for inspiration, for hope, and for direction as we, pursue a goal of reparations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many beautiful community-led initiatives that are life-giving and centered on honoring life, which I think, unfortunately, many of our institutions are not life-giving. Certainly not for Black folks, but for many, many marginalized communities in our city. So I can speak to the work that I do with Cambridge Heart. We are a completely grassroots developed community initiative that is reimagining how we think about community safety, that centers people's self-determination, that ensures that when people need help and support, they are not going to be further criminalized, that when we think about safety, we're not just thinking about a moment in time, but the conditions in our society and our communities that support our well-being. So healthy food, like Professor Brooks was speaking to, access to healthy food, education that's honoring our histories and affirming of our identities, all identities and lineages. Access to healthcare is like a basic human right to be well. My 7-month-old daughter goes to Page Academy in Roxbury. I think of that as a beautiful institution where I see the Kwanzaa principles lived out among children starting from age 0 up through 12 years old. So I think about little pockets of people organizing with each other, really building meaningful community and developing community cohesion and really trying to disrupt cycles of harm that come from our history and are perpetuated both through the institutions that we live under, but also through intergenerational trauma, in the ways that we enact the kinds of oppressions that we've experienced on each other.
Indeed, and I would say, for those who are merely listening, they cannot see that Dara has Octavia Butler on her earrings, and so we're all looking towards the future right now. But at the same time, of course, we know that Octavia Butler did not look towards the future without acknowledging the culture that we would bring with us and the human characteristics that we would bring along with us. Yeah. So I'm curious to know, what do you all feel like a culture of repair looks like, and how can we and our leaders embody it? Professor Brooks?
When we think about a culture of repair, I think it ultimately means a culture of healing. And by healing, I don't mean a kind of superficial emotional reconciling of individuals or communities in terms of Black people, Latinos, Asians, but healing in a real deep sense. So in other words, where you have Black people who are disproportionately, discriminatorily excluded from housing. And that's not only a housing harm, it's a dignity harm. It's a humiliation harm. And so healing would mean, yes, ensuring that Black people have access to housing, ownership of housing, access to capital, but also the dignity that comes from having an ownership stake in your city, being honored as being full citizens and participants in the civic life of Boston. So healing goes way beyond simply reconciling people to one another, but a healing of economic relationships, a healing of political relationships. So in other words, we're not second or third class citizens in a city that's been a cradle of democracy, a cradle of abolitionism, but also a cradle, if you will, of Black aspiration. So healing is deep and three-dimensional.
We think about all the time how reparations might change the way we might interact with our neighbors. And I think it's tough to imagine that without making sure that we can educate our neighbors about what reparations actually is, what it actually can manifest as. I know that, we've seen it, depicted in popular culture as just, literally money being handed out. I mean, we all remember that Chappelle skit where everybody's celebrating being rich in the, in the streets of a Black neighborhood. But obviously reparations doesn't always look like, getting a check from the government. I'm curious, Callie, what you think of how reparations might change the way we think about our neighbors, about community safety even.
Well, if you pick up from what Professor Brooks has said and what Dara has said, then it assumes that certain kinds of resources are, dare I say it, equal across all communities. So it would not be surprising to anyone that you would be able to access what only a few are able to. It's what we even might call concierge service right now when we talk about healthcare, where you can only get certain doctors or you can only get certain other healthcare providers. And sometimes you can't even get them in telehealth anymore because that's reserved now for certain folks, not for everybody.
Right.
So when the assumption is that everybody has access, then that's what it looks like. And and by the way, when I say assumption, that we don't even think about it. So it's that much embedded that it would be surprising if it were not so. You go somewhere and somebody jumps ahead of you in line, so to speak, and you're like, no. And other people say, as has happened to me,
right.
No, she was first or she was here before. That kind of assumption that's really embedded in both a kind of understanding and in a very practical way.
Indeed, indeed. And on that note, I think that, it's tough to see how, especially, I feel like we're at a period of regression when it comes to, I think, our manners towards one another. I think there are people, certainly public figures, politicians, who are giving people the permission, it seems to be, their worst selves in public and otherwise. And so I'm curious to know, how does the work that you're doing, Dara, people who are on the ground level trying to do this kind of community work, how is that affected by the resistance to things such as reparations?
I mean, I think we're really sitting with our own physical safety even. I mean, thinking about the security of our organization. I think we came about through the organizing that came from the uprisings in 2020, the invitation or the imagination that was kind of opened up to really think about what would our communities look like without the institution of policing, and how do we take care of each other in a different way, and not rely on some of these state structures that are rooted in the harms of the past, slavery in particular. And so I think we're definitely in a moment, I see it in our city politics, of like a real pushback or a questioning of whether this is even a legitimate project to be undertaking, and support and, some of the political support. And this is in a very quote unquote progressive city. I think there's a facade of progressivism in Cambridge. I grew up there and in Boston, but I've seen how Cambridge has a particular reputation that's not really what exists on the ground in the same way. So yeah, I would just say that we're not seeing the kind of, at least even superficial support that we saw several years ago, in trying to create these community-led projects.
That's unfortunate, because I feel like we've seen certainly over the last 10 years, say since Ta-Nehisi Coates made his case for reparations in the Atlantic, since we've seen across the country, occasional episodes of reparations, such as Bruce's Beach in Southern California. I'm curious to know what you all feel like actually is owed. What is really, owed to Black folks who are the descendants of slaves, but also those who are not and still affected by the same policies that create and maintain inequity. I want to hear I want us to hear quickly from the Massachusetts State Representative Brandy Fluker Oakley. She did an interview with us and had something interesting to say with regards to what is owed.
I don't want it to be such a novelty that there's only 4 Black women in the entire legislature, but maybe we'd have like 16 to 20 to 40, right? Maybe instead of 1 Black bank, we have 5 Black banks right here in Boston. Maybe instead of having the like 10 known Black developers in the city of Boston, we actually have over 250. I think it would get us to what it was supposed to be when the Civil War ended. And I think, quite honestly, we're owed that at a minimum.
Professor Brooks, contextualizing all of that within history, what are we owed at a minimum, do you feel?
I think we're owed at a minimum all of the tools that we need to live rich and abundant lives. And what I mean by that is when we look at the research, my colleague and I, Linda Bilmus, have done a paper where we've analyzed programs that are not called reparations, but are in fact reparatory. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that America, on a regular and routine basis, recognizes physical harms, economic harms, social harms, health harms, educational harms, and in a variety of ways attempts to make people whole. So when you ask the question, what are we owed? We are owed what is necessary to make us whole. And that includes economic assistance where necessary, housing assistance and ownership and capital where necessary. It also means health care where necessary in order to make people whole. And we know from this research that America not only does this, but is in fact good at it. Right? This is really important. So if we give people what they are indeed owed, it opens up doors of opportunity and abundance. What we heard in the legislators' remarks was we shouldn't just have one of each, one banker, one corporation, one this, one that, one safe Black person on the street. We need abundance of public safety. It includes being safe from the police as well as safe from people who are engaged in criminal conduct, but also abundance in terms of housing, healthcare, education. And all of this is additive, not just for Black people, but for everybody. Because what we know from reparatory programs in the past is whenever Black people benefit a little, everybody else benefits. And one example of that is, think about this. Senator Edmund Pettus, as in the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Oh, yes.
When Callie House supported reparations well over 100 years ago, Senator Edmund Pettus, the segregationist, he supported reparations too. Why? Because he figured if Black people get something, white people will most certainly get something too.
Yeah, that part never really seems to get mentioned, does it? And also, we look forward to reading more about research next week as we're taping. It's June 4th, and we look forward to seeing that research on the 12th. Callie, I'd love to hear your reaction to this as well as yours, Dara. What is actually owed beyond, I guess you could say the financial remunerations that we keep hearing about with regards to reparations?
So I have to go back to the 40 acres and a mule because we were promised that.
Amen.
So if you were to take that and then do the economics of it, the math, which I am horrible at, where would we be at this point? We had gotten that at that point. Then we'd all be in a space with other folks, as you've said, working, trying to make a living, but we'd be here together. That level playing field that everybody keeps talking about, we'd be a lot closer to it. Mm-hmm. We'd also be at a space where the assumption is that when you talk about harm, that people acknowledge that harm. Mm. That harm is acknowledged, and it's not like you resent acknowledging the harm because you understood what it meant then and what it took away from me to get to this point. Mm-hmm. And then I think about, from the podcast series, What is Owed, the Evanston, Illinois example and the research there that determined that everybody in the community, white people and Black, once it started, hey, this is working. As Professor Brooks has said, this is okay.
Indeed.
So that's what I think.
And if our audience has not heard about that Evanston example, certainly go back to episode 5 of this series and give a listen to the full episode. Dara?
Yeah, I appreciate what's being shared. I think it would mean a radical restructuring of our whole society. if we think about slavery being at this foundation around creating a capitalist society where they're inherently, if you have enough, someone has less than you, right?
Right.
And I think that point about abundance is so significant, right? That there's an understanding that there's an abundance of resources for everybody, and that it wouldn't be an anomaly for people to have what they needed. So yeah, I just end it there. I think there's a structural reshifting.
Well, I think that, to that point, though, we've had radical restructurings of our society before, as difficult and as impossible to some that may seem. I'm sorry, we've had this before. We've done it before, and there's no reason we can't undertake it now. With that, we're going to take a break for a word from our sponsor.
Support for What Is Owed comes from Well Withal. Well Withal believes that self-care is community care. Premium products crafted for your daily wellness, from sleep support to heart health to your daily regimen. 20% of Well Withal's profits are committed to leading the fight for health equity. They won't stop until it's truly Well Withal.
And we're back with Callie Crossley of GBH News, Professor Cornell William Brooks of Harvard University, and Dara of Cambridge Hart. I want to go back to the idea of a future Boston and what Black communities in particular here, Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, what would they look like if we had reparations tomorrow? And what would Nubian Square look like? What would these communities transform into? And Dara, I'll start with you. What do you think?
Yeah, I used to live in Fort Hill in Roxbury, where there's a wealth of community gardens, and I often thought about that little oasis. There's a lot of Black elders there that have lived there for generations. That kind of space would permeate everywhere. So there would be just a vibrant community of folks sharing food and having community-based schooling and education that young people could attend and participate in, intergenerational spaces for folks. I imagine businesses or, exchanging of resources that is from the diaspora, because there's many of us here in the city from many different parts of the African diaspora, really, really rich. And I think there's little moments of that you see, or little pockets of that you do see in Nubian Square, Nubian Market that's been built, these gorgeous murals that have, popped up in many parts of Roxbury and Dorchester. But yeah, I think of neighborhoods where people have control over their resources and also have options and choices for how they want to live their lives.
But one problem I anticipate, of course, is that as we see neighborhoods improve, quote unquote, improve, we often see the gentrification that comes with it. And Callie, I'm curious to see, what you think about how do you feel like the city might change, and how do you resist the negative change that comes along with the positive?
Well, first of all, if the city changed in the way that I would imagine it, then a lot of these tribal boundaries would be gone. So therefore, it might not be as much an issue about gentrification, because there would be a kind of fusion all across, you know what I mean? And again, we're here now. Right. So it's not that I need to rush over here and boot you out. I can be here, or I can be there, or I can be there, and have the same kinds of resources and availability. But one thing that comes to mind, because I think in very specific situations, the trees along Melnia Cass, there has been a big fight going on to preserve those trees and for the shade, and because it's all concrete and so much heat index in that particular area, which is close to where Black folk live.
Right.
That is not the case, as I've described, in other parts of the city. So if we're talking about radical reimagination, we're not having an argument about those trees. Those trees are preserved. Those trees are a part of the community, and everybody's thrilled to have them there. That's not even a discussion.
Indeed. That actually brings us to the point. We're talking literally about shade here. It's not necessarily reparations is not always about necessarily what buildings are being erected or what it's about literally sometimes what we are feeling. It's not about necessarily what we're able to see. And I'm curious to know, Professor, are there areas feel, in turn that, whether tangible or not, that need repair before others?
Well, one of the things that I'm mindful of in terms of areas that need repair before others is I think about the fact that we have an existential deadline on the planet in terms of climate change. But reparations represents a generational opportunity. So if we look at the convergence of climate change and reparations and think about we can literally repair and heal and protect our communities for the future. So what that means, beautifying and greening and growing our communities. And to my colleague's point, Callie's point about protecting our communities and protecting them from gentrification. So one of the things we know is if we invest in jobs and the housing and the incomes of the people in the communities as well as those who are coming to the community, what that means is everybody benefits. And that means green economic, and by green I mean green environmentally,
yes,
but green in terms of money. Money for the people who are already in the community as well as those who are moving to the community. That ensures that we're all prepared to embrace a future with climate change. And that means really investing in a much more thoughtful way, in a long-term way, and in terms of capital, not merely income, not merely new houses.
Now, as far as we mentioned, housing, we've mentioned a lot of different areas. One thing I would also like to bring more attention to is education. And when you speak about intangible forms of reparation, I feel like to some degree our minds are at the forefront of that. And I want to take us to a quote from Jessica Tang, who is the president of the Boston Teachers Union and the newly elected president of the American Federations of Teachers here in Massachusetts.
We would see welcoming buildings where families know that they are welcome to be there and are a true partner. We'd see robust before school and after school programs as needed, extracurriculars. We wouldn't just have one elementary school with a marching band. We'd have lots of schools with music programs and athletics and arts, and of course, strong academics. But again, school buildings that reflect the characteristics of the communities that they're serving, but also all the opportunities that they haven't always been afforded.
And on that note, to what degree do you feel, Dara, is reparations about making sure that kids can believe in themselves and realize their full potential? Because ultimately, yes, the buildings help keep them comfortable as they learn and provide them a space to do so, and we give them instruments and tools to do that. But ultimately, it's about what's up here.
100%. I'm actually a former Boston public school teacher, so really grounded in what Jessica was speaking to. I worked at Boston Arts Academy, which is the only visual and performing arts public high school in Boston. And I think about, and a big question of mine was, what is healing in the classroom? And I think healing for young people is being witnessed and seen for their gifts. And I don't think that's the norm, unfortunately. So I think we would be engaging in creating school communities that supported their educators too. I think we think about scarcity, like we don't have the resources to adequately support young people in schools because we're understaffed. And we don't have there's obviously the material access to resources in terms of arts and other kinds of programming, but also to have curriculum and school days that are organized around supporting young people holistically, their passions, but their spiritual, their physical, their emotional, their intellectual needs and aspirations. And I think, that can sound abstract, but I think there's many ways we could understand that being organized into a school day differently than what we currently have.
I hesitate to bring this up because I feel like we're coming up with some amazing things that our communities need. We're talking about the things that kids have long needed to realize their full potential. But at the same time, of course, we have to recognize that there are people working actively to prevent us even inching forward in the fight towards reparations. And I'm curious to know what you all feel like the Trump era has done to not just our society, but how it's affected the reparations efforts specifically, and how the right's criminalization of knowledge and rejection of diversity has set back efforts. Callie, my question is, are we now owed more because of these regressions?
Well, if you start talking about percentages from those 40 acres and a mule, of course, because the years keep passing. So let's start there. Even I can do that math.
We're collecting interest.
We're collecting interest. Okay. But of course, what the Trump era lack of discourse has done is given some people permission to say and articulate and to keep a drumbeat on the kind of racism that for a minute was a little bit at bay, or at least in a position where a number of other folks would answer publicly and say, that's not right. Now we have fewer people, it feels to me, who will say, you know what, don't say that, that's not right. Mm-hmm. There are still some, thank God, but I don't see the vigorousness or the numbers that I think should be there. It also, beats a drum on the kind of myths that people continue to carry about, why Black folks would be or owed anything. Again, it comes back to the lack of understanding about our history, how we all came here, whatever. These are the things that are not being grasped. And so I worry about that just gets worse and worse and worse. And what we've heard repeated gets in the minds of other people who should know better.
Exactly. They should know better. But, we have folks even like Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, who, frankly, has worked against, efforts to promote and further affirmative action for most of his career. And now, has reached an apotheosis of sorts when he and his court have recently outlawed affirmative action in collegiate admissions. Professor Brooks, obviously, this is not the only area in which affirmative action is alive and well, or was alive and well. But I'm curious to know how you combat folks who are not just yelling, racial slurs or being openly racist, but are saying, well, you know what? We've already done enough. Mm-hmm. We've accomplished so much. Why do you need more?
Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to appreciate the fact that when we say we need more, we means everybody. Mm-hmm. It means Black people and everybody else. So a couple of points. First, when we make reparations a political obscenity, it curses the whole of society. That means everybody loses out. We know from the GI Bill, right, when we attempted to compensate veterans for their service, it built American suburbs, it built the American middle class, it revitalized and elevated the economic trajectory of the country. So reparations for Black people would help everybody else, point one. Point two, when we look at the origins of affirmative action, the origins of affirmative action were remedial, addressing the past, addressing harms, addressing disparities in government contracts. It was remedial, repair, and attempting to make whole. So with affirmative action being taken off the books, we need to put reparations on the books, right? Mm-hmm. And lastly, with reparations in this current environment, it helps us embrace not merely the past, not merely history, but truth, facts. History. That's important for everybody.
And I just want to add about the GI Bill, because that's a really excellent example, because, Black veterans didn't get everything that everybody else was supposed to get. So we're already owed that. So, are we owed more? Yes, we are. Because if those Black veterans, including my father, had been able to get the mortgage advantages, then we would have built some family wealth, and I'd be in a different position, and so would my sisters and everybody that came after.
And I say the same as a grandson of a submarine Navy veteran from World War II, and certainly I echo that point. Dara, I'm curious to know what you think.
I mean, I 100% agree. I think that we are we're living in a moment where it's like criminal to like honor our history, honor it, and also recognize its implications in our present. And I think that's so dangerous, because it definitely means that we're going to continue to perpetuate the harms that existed. And I'm hoping in seeing that, like, we really, when I think about young people in particular coming up at this time and how they're understanding themselves and the future that they're inheriting, there is so much that needs to be done around supporting and cultivating the kind of spaces that they will have for their children and children and children. We don't think ahead like that. We don't honor and consider the generations after us and what they will need.
We only have a few minutes left, but I just want to get one last word from each of you about, how do we stay in the fight? Despite all these forces that are working to discourage us, all of the, it feels like pushing a builder up a mountain like Sisyphus. How do we stay in the fight knowing that, there are setbacks ahead? Callie, I'll start with you.
Oh, God. I need some of that faith that the Reverend over here could probably give us. Because I'm going to tell you, it's hard days. I try to remember Angela Davis's statement about I am no longer accepting the things that that can't be changed. I am, changing the things that are unacceptable to me. That she said it better than that, but that's generally what she came to. So, if we are all doing the kind of work, and all the Black folk I know do double work, their professional job and then the work of just building up the folk. So, that's all we can do. Just keep pushing in that way.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. Professor.
I would simply know this. Harriet Tubman, as the first woman to lead American troops into battle during the Civil War, delivered nearly 800 people to freedom in the low country of South Carolina. But had she compared the 800 people she freed to the 3.94 million people enslaved, she might have given up. As I tell my students, hope is not empirically demonstrated, it is morally chosen. Mm-hmm. So we have to go beyond the law, go beyond the money, and simply choose to believe that we can do what our forebears did. They got 40 acres and a mule for a minute. Mm-hmm. Let us get it for a lifetime.
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I want to bring in Mariam Kaba, who's a brilliant abolitionist, activist, scholar, organizer right now. And she talks about hope being a discipline. And I do think it is. Like, we are living in a pretty devastating time around the world. And so I think about our communities and each other, turning to each other to remember that we can create things with each other. And we have in the past, and we will continue to do that. And I also think about intergenerational communities. Like, we really need to be holding space with our youngest and our eldest to learn from each other and to imagine what we can create with that. And I mean, we're doing it every single day, as the professor said. We're creating these small projects and these even moments, right, of freedom and liberation with each other. And so those are the things I hold on to. The moment to moment.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful note for us to end on. And I just want to thank you here, Callie Crossley, Cornell William Brooks, and Dara Beyer. Thank you for joining me today. And also thank you to Jessica Tang and Brandy Fluker Oakley for participating with us. And again, I'm Jamil Smith, the editor-in-chief of The Emancipator, which you can find at theemancipator.org. And now we're back with the host of this esteemed podcast, Soraya Winter-Smith from GBH. Soraya, I know that, there's a lot that happened in that conversation, but one thing I wanted to bring out was something that Cornell William Brooks said at the beginning, which is that we are expecting better than best when it comes to the fight for reparations. This is what we can be looking forward to, the future of Boston, the future of this country. That's what reparations could actually provide. And I'm curious to know what your reflections as we reach the end of this season might be about reparations and how we all need to be a part of that struggle to achieve them.
I think that's a perfect way to end this series. One of the big points I really want folks to remember is that we're having conversations with the idea that Black people are and always have been really powerful advocates for themselves and their communities. And as we've interviewed people who are in the work and have been in the work of making financial frameworks, political advocacy, community organizing, it's all done with optimism about Black people's capacity to bring the changes to reality. The other thing I really want to emphasize is something you said to me while we were talking about this episode before, which I think is very important. And that's just that in talking to the city officials who are managing Boston's reparations effort right now, it seems like there's not a lot of rigidity. And that, at least in theory, means there's a ton of space for people to help shape what it's going to be. And I think that space to imagine is also really important for you in today's discussion.
Indeed it is. So I just want to offer my personal thanks for this series, and I certainly hope that we'll continue these conversations well beyond the podcast. And I certainly hope that you all who are listening stay tuned to GBH and to what we're doing at the Emancipator for more.
What is Owed is a production of GBH News. This episode was produced by GBH's Paul Singer and Alex LaSalvia and Amber Payne of The Emancipator. Production oversight by Lee Hill. Melee is our project manager, and the managing producer for podcasting at GBH is Devin Maverick Robbins. Mixing and sound design by David Goodman and Gary Mott. Theme song and original music by Malik Williams. Artwork by Matt Welch and Mami Hawabawo.
GBH.